Happy Wednesday. Today is Wednesday, March the 3rd, 2021, and today's daily Bible readings come to us from Psalm 105, 1 through 11, 37 through 45, Jeremiah 30, 12 through 22, and then John 12, 36 through 43. And I'm going to look at that passage from John and talk about how sometimes you just got to start with what you got. In this text, Jesus is talking to the crowds, and actually, it wouldn't be a bad idea if you wanted to read verses 34 through 43, because there's conversation that goes on before where this picks up. Sometimes they cut that off for the daily readings and the lectionary in general. I'm not really sure why they do things like that, but anyway, so there's a couple of verses of dialogue that go on before this, but basically, Jesus is having a conversation with the crowd, and it seems like the people who have heard Jesus, it seems like they had an idea of what was going on and an idea of who he was. You know, they had an inkling of that glory, that something was going on and something, was unusual, but they seemed resistant to act on it. And Jesus gives them advice. He's basically saying to them, hey, walk in the light while you've got it. He gives them a warning to do the most with the little bit that they've got while they have it. It's like he's talking to a crowd of people who kind of get it. They've got a little bit, but they're hesitant to really jump. Like they're afraid to or resistant to act on it. So he's saying to them, take the little bit of faith you do have, the little bit of understanding you've been given, and build on that faith. It reminds me of the same kind of advice that this guy named Peter Bowler gave to this really young guy named John Wesley, who was struggling with his call and with his faith. He had this ongoing crisis of faith where John Wesley realized that he didn't have the faith that he really thought he had. As he put it, didn't have the faith that he says... I was clearly convinced of unbelief, of the want of faith, whereby alone we are saved. And so it wasn't that, I think in Wesley's defense, coming to his defense against himself, it wasn't that he had no faith at all. It's just that he realized that the faith he did have was limited, and it wasn't the kind of faith that he needed. And so he was really conflicted by this. And Wesley, said to himself, how can you preach? It's a good question, honest question. You should just stop preaching if you don't have this faith that really saves. So how can you yourself preach? And he went to his friend Peter Bowler, who was one of the German Moravians, and said to him, I think I'm going to stop preaching because I've had this conviction that I don't have the kind of faith that I'm supposed to have. And Bowler didn't encourage him to stop preaching. Bowler's response was, no, don't do that. And, Wesley's like, well, how can I preach if I don't have faith? And Bowler's response was kind of brilliant. It's kind of like, walk in the light while you have the light, because the light might go away and then you'll be in the dark. Bowler's response was, preach faith till you have it. And then once you have faith, you'll preach it because you have it. It's kind of, very, very, I don't know what it is. Anyway, so he says, gives him this advice: preach faith until you have it, and then because you have it, you'll preach it. That's really good advice. And sometimes, I think we get caught up on, we can kind of see the truth of Christ. We get a little taste of it, but we don't feel like we understand enough to really do anything about it. And Jesus's advice is like, look, if you got a little bit of light, take advantage of it and go as far as you can with it, because you never know when you're going to end up in the darkness, kind of like John Wesley, and he's talking to a bunch of people that don't fully understand who it is that they have in front of them, who it is that they have guiding them through the darkness, this crowd that he's talking to. And he's encouraging them. He's like, you've got an idea. You've got some idea of what's going on here. Take advantage of that. Take the little bit of light you've been given, and take advantage of it. But here's the sad thing. The text goes on, and you've got these people who are just kind of blind. They're blind and blinded by the love of glory. So there's some people, it goes on to tell us, that even though they had some idea, even though they could see, they've been gifted a little bit of light to see in the darkness, They just refused. They were just going to refuse. They had had enough light to see by, and they knew that they hated what they saw, right? And so they were just going to turn away. They were just going to refuse. But the saddest thing to me are the people that we hear in verse 42 through 43, that they had enough light. They got enough of a clue that they could see what was going on, and they had enough of light to just even believe a little bit. But they were so worried, and they were so in love with the glory that they could get from their fellow man, as it were. As it says in verse 43, for they loved human glory more than the glory that comes from God. Even though they had that little bit of light, they were so afraid of what it would cost them, here on earth, that they just turned away. And that's probably more sad than the people that just flat out hated who Jesus was and what Jesus had to offer. So, anyway, that's the DBR for today. Go out, walk around in the light while you got it. We'll be back tomorrow. Boop.